I'll never forget the sound of an elderly Okinawan woman crying, not from pain but from something I couldn't understand at first. It was May 15th, 1945, and I was Corpsman 2nd Class William Vreras Docu Patterson, attached to the 1st Marine Division, 5th Regiment, somewhere in the muddy hell that was southern Okinawa. The smell of cordite still hung in the air from the morning's artillery barrage, mixed with the sweet, sickening odor of frangipani flowers that somehow still bloomed among the rubble. I'd been treating wounded Marines for 3 months straight, but what I witnessed that day in a bombed-out village near Shuri would change everything I thought I knew about this war and the people we were fighting. The morning had started like any other on that god-forsaken island. I was cleaning my medical kit, morphine syrettes, sulfur powder, battle dressings, when Sergeant Murphy came running up to our aid station. "Doc, we got civilians down in the village, old folks mostly. They're hurt bad, and they ain't running from us anymore." That was unusual. For weeks, the Okinawan civilians had fled whenever they saw American uniforms, terrified by Japanese propaganda that told them we'd torture and kill them. But something had changed. I grabbed my aid bag, the same canvas satchel I'd carried since Guadalcanal, now patched with medical tape and stained with blood from a dozen different battles. Inside were the tools of my trade: morphine syrettes in their little metal tubes, rolls of gauze bandages, bottles of iodine that clinked against each other with every step, sulfur powder in small paper packets, and a stethoscope that had somehow survived 3 amphibious landings. My hands were steady as I checked my supplies, but my mind was racing. Treating enemy civilians wasn't exactly covered in our Navy Hospital Corps training back at Great Lakes Naval Station in Illinois. The walk to the village took us through what had once been a beautiful Okinawan settlement. Traditional wooden houses with red tile roofs lay in splinters, their paper screens torn and scattered like confetti across the muddy ground. Ancient stone walls that had stood for centuries were reduced to rubble, and I could see the careful craftsmanship that had gone into building them. Stones fitted together without mortar, held in place by skill and tradition that went back generations. But it was the smell that hit me hardest. Not just the smoke and destruction, but something else. Incense. Even in the middle of this devastation, someone had been burning incense at a small shrine that had somehow survived the bombardment. I'd been on Okinawa since April 1st, when we hit the beaches at Hagushi. Those first few days had been eerily quiet. Too quiet. We'd expected the Japanese to fight us at the water's edge, like they had at Iwo Jima. Instead, they let us come ashore, let us advance inland, then hit us with everything they had once we were committed. The fighting had been brutal ever since. Cave to cave, tunnel to tunnel, yard by yard through terrain that seemed designed by the devil himself. The Japanese had turned the entire southern part of the island into a fortress. Every cave was a bunker. Every hill was a strong point. Every village was a killing field. They had 155mm artillery pieces hidden in caves that could fire on us and then disappear before our counter-battery fire could find them. They had machine gun nests carved into coral rock that were invisible until you were right on top of them. And they had kamikaze pilots diving their planes into our ships offshore, trying to cut off our supplies and reinforcements. I'd seen plenty of wounded Marines in those 3 months. Boys from farms in Iowa, kids from the streets of Brooklyn, college boys from California who'd never seen real violence before. I'd held their hands while they died, written letters to their mothers, closed their eyes for the last time. There was Jimmy Kowalski from Detroit, who took shrapnel in the chest and kept asking for his mother until the morphine took him away. There was Bobby Chen from San Francisco, a Chinese-American kid who spoke some Japanese and helped us interrogate prisoners until a sniper's bullet found him. There was Tommy O'Brien from Boston, who stepped on a mine and lost both legs, but kept cracking jokes until the shock finally got him. But I'd never treated an enemy civilian, never looked into the eyes of someone whose country we were destroying, and tried to heal instead of harm. The closest I'd come was treating Japanese prisoners, and even then, most of them were so fanatical they'd rather die than accept help from Americans. The few who did accept treatment looked at us with a mixture of shame and confusion, as if they couldn't understand why we weren't torturing them. When we reached the village center, I saw them. About 30 Okinawan civilians, mostly elderly, sitting in the shade of a damaged Buddhist temple. They looked up at us with eyes that held no hatred, just exhaustion and resignation. These weren't the fanatical enemies our briefings had described. They were grandfathers and grandmothers, some bleeding from shrapnel wounds, others clearly suffering from malnutrition and dehydration. Their clothes were torn and dirty, but I could see they had once been beautiful. Silk kimonos with intricate patterns, traditional Okinawan garments that spoke of a culture far older and more refined than anything I'd known back home in Cedar Rapids. The temple itself was a marvel, even in its damaged state. The roof had partially collapsed, but the wooden beams were still visible, carved with dragons and flowers in a style I'd never seen before. There were stone statues of Buddhist deities, some broken, some intact, all weathered by centuries of wind and rain. In front of the main altar, someone had placed fresh flowers. Where they'd found them in this devastation, I couldn't imagine. The first person I approached was an old man, maybe 70 years old, sitting against a stone lantern that was cracked but still standing. His left arm was wrapped in what looked like torn silk, probably from a kimono, and blood was seeping through the makeshift bandage. He looked at me with cloudy eyes, and I could see he expected to die. In his culture, I would later learn, he was preparing for an honorable death rather than the shame of being captured by foreign devils. "It's okay, grandfather," I said in my broken Japanese, using one of the few phrases our intelligence boys had taught us. "Daijobu desu." I knelt beside him and gently unwrapped his makeshift bandage. The wound was deep but clean, shrapnel from one of our own shells, probably from the 150mm howitzers that had been pounding this area for days. The metal fragment had torn through the muscle, but missed the bone and major blood vessels. As I cleaned it with iodine and began applying a proper dressing, something extraordinary happened. A young Okinawan woman, maybe his granddaughter, had been watching from about 10 feet away. She was probably in her 20s, wearing a torn but clean dress that looked like it had been carefully mended multiple times. Her hair was pulled back in the traditional style, held in place with what looked like carved wooden pins. Despite everything she'd been through, she carried herself with a dignity that reminded me of my own grandmother back home. As she saw me carefully bandaging the old man's wound, treating him with the same care I'd give any Marine, she began to cry. Not the wailing of grief, but quiet tears that seemed to come from somewhere deep inside her soul. She approached slowly, bowing repeatedly, and began speaking rapidly in the Okinawan dialect. "What's she saying?" I asked Corporal Tanaka, our Nisei interpreter who had joined us. Tanaka was a second-generation Japanese-American from Los Angeles, whose own parents had been interned at Manzanar while he fought for the country that had imprisoned them. He spoke fluent Japanese, but the Okinawan dialect was different enough that he had to concentrate to understand. His own story was complicated. He'd volunteered for the 402nd Regimental Combat Team, the all-Japanese American unit that had fought in Europe, but had been transferred to the Pacific as an interpreter when they discovered his language skills. Tanaka listened for a moment, his own eyes growing wide. "Doc, she's thanking the American spirits for showing mercy to her grandfather. She says she was told Americans would torture the elderly, make them suffer before killing them. She can't believe you're healing him instead." That's when it hit me. In Okinawan culture, the elderly weren't just respected. They were revered as living connections to the ancestors, holders of wisdom and tradition. For these families, watching foreign soldiers they'd been told were demons, treating their most precious elders with gentleness and medical skill was shattering everything they'd been told about us. I moved to the next patient, an elderly woman with a head wound. She was probably in her 60s with silver hair that had been carefully arranged despite the chaos around her. The cut on her forehead was from flying glass, probably when the windows of her house were blown out by the concussion from our artillery. The wound was about 2 inches long, not deep, but bleeding steadily. As I cleaned the cut and applied a bandage, more family members gathered around. A middle-aged man who was clearly her son watched every movement of my hands with intense concentration. When I gave her a drink from my canteen and she smiled weakly, he dropped to his knees and began bowing so deeply, his forehead touched the ground. "He's saying his mother is the most important person in his world," Tanaka translated, his voice thick with emotion. "He's asking the American kami spirits to bless you for treating her like she was your own grandmother." The woman reached up and touched my hand as I finished bandaging her wound. Her skin was soft and wrinkled like tissue paper, but her grip was surprisingly strong. She spoke in a whisper, and Tanaka leaned in to hear. "She wants to know if you have a grandmother," he translated. She says you have gentle hands like someone who was raised by a loving grandmother. I had to swallow hard before I could answer. I'd tell her yes. Tell her my grandmother raised me after my parents died. Tell her she taught me to always respect my elders. When Tanaka translated this, the woman's eyes filled with tears. She spoke again, more urgently this time, her words tumbling over each other. She says her grandson was killed fighting in the Philippines. She says you remind her of him, that he had the same kind eyes. She's asking the spirits of her ancestors to protect you because you've honored her family. Word spread quickly through the village. More civilians began emerging from hiding places, caves, damaged houses, even from beneath rubble where they'd taken shelter during the bombardment. They brought their elderly with them, carrying grandparents on their backs, supporting great aunts who could barely walk. Each time I treated one of their elders, the same thing happened. Tears, bowing, expressions of disbelief that gradually transformed into something approaching gratitude. One moment stands out above all the others. An ancient woman, probably in her 80s, had been burned when her house caught fire during the bombardment. Her burns weren't life-threatening, but they were painful, covering her left arm and shoulder. The skin was red and blistered, and infection was a real risk in the tropical heat and humidity. She was lying on a woven mat, and I could see she was trying not to cry out from the pain. As I applied sulfur powder and clean bandages, she reached up with a trembling hand and touched my face. She spoke in a whisper, and Tanaka had to lean in close to hear. She says you have kind eyes, he translated. She says you remind her of her grandson, who was killed fighting in the Philippines. She wants to know if your grandmother is proud of you for showing mercy to old women like her. I had to stop working for a moment. My own grandmother, back in Iowa, had raised me after my parents died in a car accident when I was 8. She taught me that respect for elders was one of the most important virtues a person could have. She'd made me help her care for the elderly members of our church, taught me to listen to their stories, to value their wisdom. Every Sunday after church, we'd visit the old folks' home and she'd have me read to them or just sit and listen to their memories. Tell her yes, I said quietly. Tell her my grandmother would be very proud. The old woman smiled, the first genuine smile I'd seen from any Okinawan civilian, and patted my cheek like I was her own grandson. Around us, her family was crying openly now, not from sadness, but from a kind of overwhelming relief and confusion. Their entire worldview was being turned upside down. As the day wore on, I treated 17 elderly Okinawans. Shrapnel wounds, burns, malnutrition, dehydration, nothing I couldn't handle with basic field medicine. But each treatment was witnessed by families who had expected their elders to be tortured or killed. Instead, they watched American medics use precious medical supplies that could have gone to wounded Marines, to heal their most revered family members. The transformation was remarkable. By afternoon, children who had been hiding began to peek out from behind their parents. Young mothers who had clutched their babies in terror began to relax. The elderly themselves, once they realized they weren't going to be harmed, began to show a dignity and grace that was humbling to witness. One grandfather, after I'd treated his infected leg wound, insisted on sharing his last bit of food with me, a small rice ball wrapped in seaweed. It wasn't much, but in a place where people were starving, it was everything. When I tried to refuse, Tanaka explained that refusing would be a grave insult. He's treating you like an honored guest, Doc. In his mind, you've just saved his life and honored his family. He has to reciprocate. I ate that rice ball, and it was the best meal I'd had since leaving the States. It tasted of salt and seaweed and something else. Hope, maybe. As I ate, the old man watched with satisfaction, nodding approvingly. He said something to Tanaka, who smiled for the first time all day. He says you eat like his grandson used to, with appreciation for every grain of rice. He says his grandson would have liked you. The old man then did something that surprised everyone. He reached into his torn jacket and pulled out a small photograph, carefully wrapped in oiled paper to protect it from the humidity. It showed a young man in a Japanese military uniform, probably taken before he shipped out to the Philippines. The grandfather pointed to the photo, then to me, and spoke earnestly to Tanaka. He says his grandson was about your age when he left for the war. He says you both have the same serious expression, like you're carrying the weight of the world on your shoulders. He wants to know if you have family waiting for you at home. I told him about my grandmother, about the small farm in Iowa where I'd grown up, about the girl I'd left behind. Mary Ellen, who worked at the Five and Dime in town and wrote me letters every week. The old man listened to the translation with intense interest, nodding as if he understood the universal language of young men far from home. As evening approached, something unprecedented happened. The village elder, a man named Shimabukuro-san, who was probably 90 years old, asked to speak with me through Tanaka. He had been watching all day as I treated his neighbors and family members. Now he wanted to perform a small ceremony. Shimabukuro-san was a remarkable figure. Despite his age and the trauma of the bombardment, he carried himself with the bearing of someone who had been a leader his entire life. His white hair was carefully combed, his traditional Okinawan robes were torn but clean, and his eyes held a wisdom that seemed to span generations. He walked with a carved wooden cane, and when he moved, people stepped aside with obvious respect. He had me sit on a woven mat in front of the damaged temple. The entire village gathered around, maybe 60 people from babies to great-grandparents. Shimabukuro-san spoke for several minutes in formal Okinawan, his voice carrying the weight of decades. Even though I couldn't understand the words, I could hear the rhythm and cadence of formal speech, the kind of language used for important occasions. It reminded me of the way our preacher back home spoke during communion, or the way my grandmother talked when she was saying grace over Sunday dinner. Tanaka translated as he went, and he says that for 70 years, he has been the keeper of his family's ancestral tablets. He says the spirits of his ancestors have been angry because foreign armies brought death to their sacred island. But today, he says, the ancestors have seen that some foreigners carry healing in their hands instead of only death. He wants to ask his ancestors to protect you because you have shown that Americans can honor the old ways. The old man then did something that made everyone gasp. He bowed to me, not the quick, polite bow of greeting, but the deep, formal bow reserved for the most honored guests. In Okinawan culture, a village elder bowing to a young foreign soldier was almost unthinkable. But there he was, showing me the highest respect his culture could offer. "Doc," Tanaka whispered, "you need to bow back. This is huge. He's basically adopting you into the village family." I bowed as deeply as I could, trying to show the same respect he'd shown me. When I looked up, half the village was crying again. But these weren't tears of fear or confusion anymore. They were tears of relief, of hope, of a kind of healing that went deeper than any medicine I could provide. Shimabukuro-san wasn't finished. He called forward a young boy, maybe 10 years old, who had been hiding behind his mother all day. The boy approached nervously, carrying something wrapped in silk. The old man spoke to him gently, and the boy unwrapped the package to reveal a small carved stone, smooth and warm from being carried. Through Tanaka, Shimabukuro-san explained that this was a protective charm that had been in his family for generations. It had been carved by his great-grandfather, blessed by the village priests and carried by the men of his family through wars and disasters for over a century. The stone was about the size of a silver dollar, carved with symbols that looked like stylized waves and clouds. He wanted me to have it so that his ancestors would watch over me for the rest of the war. He says, Tanaka continued, that his family has never given this charm to someone who wasn't blood family, but he says you've shown more honor to his people than some of their own sons. He wants you to carry it, and when the war is over, he wants you to remember that you have family here in Okinawa. I took the stone with trembling hands. It was warm and smooth, carved with symbols I didn't recognize, but somehow understood, represented protection and blessing. As I held it, the old man placed his hands over mine and spoke a blessing in the ancient Okinawan language. Even without understanding the words, I could feel the power and sincerity behind them. That night, as we prepared to move out to rejoin our unit, Shimabukuro-san approached me one last time. He was carrying a small wooden box, and inside was a letter written in careful English. He had asked one of the younger villagers, who had learned some English before the war, to write it for him. The letter read, "To the American doctor with kind hands. You have shown my people that not all foreign soldiers bring only death. You have honored our elders and blessed our families. When you return to your home across the great ocean, please tell your people that the people of Okinawa are not your enemies. We are farmers and fishermen who want only to live in peace with our ancestors. You will always have a place at our table and in our prayers. May your ancestors watch over you as ours will watch over you." I still have that letter. It's sitting in my desk drawer next to the protective stone, both of them yellowed with age, but still carrying the weight of that extraordinary day. Whenever I look at them, I remember that day when I learned that healing isn't just about treating wounds. It's about treating people with the dignity and respect they deserve, regardless of which side of a war they're on. The impact of that day rippled outward in ways I couldn't have imagined. Word spread to other villages that American medics were treating Okinawan civilians with kindness. More families began emerging from hiding, bringing their wounded and sick to our aid stations. The intelligence boys said it was one of the factors that helped end the resistance in our sector earlier than expected. But for me, the real impact was personal. I'd grown up thinking that war was about us versus them, good guys versus bad guys. That day in the village taught me that it's more complicated than that. Those Okinawan families weren't my enemies. They were just people caught in the middle of something bigger than themselves, trying to protect the people they loved most. I served another 4 months on Okinawa before the war ended. During that time, I treated hundreds more civilians, and each time I saw that same transformation, fear giving way to trust, hatred dissolving into gratitude. It wasn't just about the medical care. It was about seeing their elders treated with respect, about watching American soldiers honor the values that Okinawan culture held most sacred. The old woman who touched my face that first day, I saw her again 2 weeks later. She had brought her great-grandson to our aid station because he had developed a fever. When she saw me, she smiled and bowed, then said something to the little boy. He looked up at me with curious eyes instead of fear, and I realized that maybe, just maybe, we were breaking a cycle of hatred that could have lasted generations. 3 weeks after that first encounter, something remarkable happened. Shimabukuro-san sent word through the village network that he wanted to see me again. When I arrived at the village, I found that they had rebuilt their small shrine and were holding a ceremony to honor their ancestors. But this time they wanted to include a prayer for the American medics who had helped their people. This has never happened before, Tanaka explained as we watched the ceremony. They're asking their ancestors to protect foreign soldiers. It's unprecedented. During the ceremony, Shimabukuro-san called me forward and had me place a stick of incense at the shrine. As the smoke rose, he spoke a prayer that Tanaka translated. We ask our honored ancestors to watch over the American healer who has shown kindness to your children and grandchildren. We ask that his ancestors be proud of him as we are grateful to him. Standing there, participating in a religious ceremony of a people I'd been taught to see as enemies, I felt something shift inside me. This wasn't about politics or military strategy anymore. This was about human beings recognizing the humanity in each other, even in the middle of the most brutal war in human history. The ceremony lasted about an hour, with prayers and offerings and the burning of incense. At one point, they brought out a large drum and began a traditional dance. The dancers moved slowly, gracefully, their movements telling a story I couldn't understand, but somehow felt in my bones. It was a story of loss and hope, of death and renewal, of the eternal cycle of life that continues even in the midst of war. After the ceremony, the villagers insisted on sharing a meal with us. They had so little, some rice, a few vegetables, some fish that the children had caught in a nearby stream, but they shared it all. We sat in a circle on woven mats, eating with chopsticks and drinking tea from small ceramic cups. The conversation was halting, filtered through Tanaka's translations, but somehow we understood each other. One of the younger men, who spoke a little English, told me about his life before the war. He had been a teacher in the village school, had studied at the university in Naha before the fighting started. He showed me a book of poetry he had saved from the bombing, pages yellowed and torn, but still readable. The poems were about the beauty of Okinawa, about the changing seasons, about the love between grandparents and grandchildren. This is what we are fighting for, sheep, he said in careful English. Not for empire or glory, but for the right to teach our children about beauty, about respect for elders, about the old ways that make us who we are. As the weeks passed, I found myself returning to the village whenever I could. Each time I brought medical supplies, bandages, iodine, aspirin, and each time I learned something new about Okinawan culture. I learned about their reverence for nature, their belief that the spirits of the ancestors lived in the trees and rocks and streams. I learned about their traditional medicine, their use of herbs and massage and meditation to heal both body and spirit. Most importantly, I learned about their concept of family. In Okinawan culture, Family wasn't just about blood relations, it was about anyone who showed kindness and respect to the elders. By treating their grandparents and great-grandparents with dignity, I had become part of their extended family, with all the rights and responsibilities that entailed. One day, about a month after our first meeting, Shimabukuro-san asked me to help with a special ceremony. His own grandfather had died just before the war started, and the family hadn't been able to perform the proper funeral rites because of the fighting. Now, with peace beginning to return to their corner of the island, they wanted to honor his memory. The ceremony was unlike anything I'd ever experienced. The entire village participated, bringing flowers and food and incense to place at a small altar they had constructed. Shimabukuro-san spoke about his grandfather's life, about the wisdom he had passed down, about the love he had shown to his family and community. Then, to my amazement, he asked me to speak. Through Tanaka, he explained that as an adopted member of the family, I had the right and responsibility to honor the memory of their ancestor. I didn't know what to say, but I spoke from the heart about the importance of remembering those who came before us, about the wisdom of elders, about the hope that their memory would inspire future generations to choose healing over harm. When I finished speaking, there wasn't a dry eye in the village. Shimabukuro-san embraced me like a son, and I felt the weight of belonging to something larger than myself, something that transcended nationality and race and the artificial divisions that war creates. After the war ended, I stayed in touch with Tanaka, who helped me understand more about what I'd witnessed. He explained that in traditional Okinawan society, the elderly weren't just respected, they were considered the bridge between the living and the dead, the keepers of family honor and cultural memory. When American medics treated these revered figures with care and dignity, it challenged everything the Japanese military had told them about American brutality. "You didn't just heal their bodies, Doc," Tanaka told me years later when we met at a veterans reunion in Los Angeles. "You healed their faith in humanity. You showed them that even in war there can be compassion." Tanaka also told me something that I hadn't known at the time. After the war, he had returned to Okinawa as part of the occupation forces and had visited the village where we'd first encountered those civilians. Shimabukuro-san was still alive, still serving as the village elder, and he had asked Tanaka to help him write another letter to me. In that letter, the old man explained that the village had decided to create a small memorial to honor the American medics who had treated their people during the war. It wasn't a monument to victory or defeat, but a simple stone marker acknowledging that even in the darkest times, some people choose healing over harm, compassion over cruelty. "And he wants you to know," Tanaka had written, "and that your name is carved on that stone, along with the names of the other medics who helped his people. He says that as long as the village exists, the story of the American doctors who honored the Okinawan elders will be passed down to each new generation." Looking back now, I realize that day changed me as much as it changed them. I went into that village thinking I was just doing my job, treating wounded people because that's what medics do. But I came out understanding something deeper about what it means to be human, about how small acts of kindness can bridge even the widest cultural divides. The tears I saw that day weren't just about medical treatment. They were about recognition, families recognizing that their most precious values were being honored by people they'd been taught to hate. They were about hope, hope that maybe this war wouldn't destroy everything they held sacred. And they were about healing, not just physical healing, but the kind of emotional and spiritual healing that happens when people see their common humanity reflected in each other's eyes. When I returned home to Iowa after the war, I carried those lessons with me. I used my GI Bill benefits to go to medical school, became a family doctor in a small town outside Cedar Rapids. For 40 years, I treated 3 generations of families, and I tried to bring the same respect and dignity to every patient that I had learned to show those Okinawan elders. I never forgot the lesson that Shimabukuro-san taught me that day, that healing is sacred work, that every person deserves to be treated with dignity regardless of their age, race, or nationality. I tried to pass that lesson on to my own children and grandchildren, to the medical students I taught at the university, to anyone who would listen. In 1995, 50 years after the war ended, I received an unexpected package in the mail. Inside was a photograph of the memorial stone that Shimabukuro-san had told Tanaka about, along with a letter from his grandson, who had learned English and wanted to thank me for the kindness I had shown his grandfather and his village. The letter read, "My grandfather passed away last year at the age of 102. Until the day he died, he told the story of the American doctor who honored our elders during the war. He said that you taught him that enemies can become friends when they see each other's humanity. He wanted me to tell you that you will always be remembered as family in our village." The photograph showed a simple stone marker, about 3 feet tall, with names carved in both English and Japanese characters. My name was there, along with the names of other medics who had treated Okinawan civilians during the war. At the base of the stone were fresh flowers, and I could see that someone had been taking care of it, keeping the memory alive. But what moved me most was a second photograph, showing a group of children gathered around the memorial while an elderly woman, probably one of the grandchildren I had treated, told them the story of the American medics. The children were listening with rapt attention, their faces serious and respectful. In their eyes I could see the same dignity and grace that I had witnessed in their great-grandparents all those years ago. That moment changed everything for me. I served another 4 months after that day, but I never looked at the Okinawan people or any enemy civilians the same way again. Every time I treated someone, I remembered those tears, that gratitude, that old man's blessing. It reminded me that behind every uniform, every flag, every political cause, there are just people trying to protect the ones they love. This was the story of Corpsman Second Class William Hortons Docu Patterson, 1st Marine Division, who witnessed the profound cultural impact of American medical care on Okinawan families during the final months of World War II. His account, documented in his personal diary and later interviews with the Veterans History Project, represents one of countless examples of how individual acts of compassion helped heal the wounds of war on both sides. Patterson's experience was part of a larger pattern during the Okinawa campaign, where American medical personnel treated thousands of civilian casualties with the same care given to their own wounded. This approach, driven by military medical ethics and basic human decency, played a crucial role in winning the trust of the Okinawan population and reducing civilian casualties in the final phase of the Pacific War. The village memorial that Shimabukuro-san created still stands today, maintained by the descendants of the families that Patterson treated. It serves as a reminder that even in humanity's darkest hours, individual choices to show compassion can create ripples of healing that last for generations. What struck you most about Doc Patterson's story? Have you heard similar accounts of medical personnel crossing cultural and military lines to provide care? These personal stories remind us that even in humanity's darkest hours, individual choices to show compassion can create ripples of healing that last for generations. If you want to hear more first-hand accounts like this one, make sure to subscribe and hit that notification bell. Tomorrow we'll be sharing the story of Lieutenant Sarah Chen, an army nurse who witnessed Japanese soldiers surrendering to receive medical care for their wounded comrades, and how that moment of trust changed the final days of the war in the Philippines. These voices from the past deserve to be heard. Let's make sure their stories of humanity in the midst of inhumanity live on.